Welcome to the Hope and Focus podcast, where hope has a voice. We highlight the journeys of those impacted by Leber congenital amaurosis and other inherited retinal diseases, and the work driving change. Thanks for being here.
Welcome, everyone, to the Hope and Focus podcast. I'm your host, Ben Shaberman, Science Communications Advisor to Hope and Focus, and I am very much looking forward to my discussion for this episode with Beth Borsowitz. And Beth is an education consultant for the Bureau of Education Services for the Blind within the Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services. And she supports children with visual impairments and their families throughout the educational journey, helping them navigate planning low vision resources and accessing other essential supports. I know that for many families with kids with low vision, the educational journey presents many challenges, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all path or solution. So I think my conversation with Beth will provide some helpful insights for navigating that low vision educational journey. And Beth, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you as a guest.
Thanks so much for having me, Ben. I'm looking forward to our conversation this afternoon.
And I am as well. And I want to give a little more background on Beth. She is a certified teacher of students with visual impairments, also known as a TVI. She provides specialized guidance on accessible learning, adapts materials, and teaches skills that foster independence. Beth has a master's degree in vision studies from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She also serves as vice chair on the board of directors for Hope and Focus and has been a passionate volunteer since Hope and Focus was founded back in 2014. So, Beth, I'd like to start off with a conversation about how you got involved in teaching students and doing this educational consulting for students with vision impairments, because that's not how you started your career, correct?
No, absolutely correct. My undergrad is actually in sport and leisure management. So it's sort of total ends of the spectrum, opposite ends of the spectrum. So I was with my undergrad, I then ended up as a preschool teacher, believe it or not, in a private school. And I had a little girl who was 3 years old in my class who was newly diagnosed with LCA named Sophia Preby. And the journey began there. Her mother, Laura, as I'm sure many of you listening to this podcast have had the pleasure of meeting, has a way with words and makes it really hard to say no. So when they decided to go public school with Sophia to get more services, Laura asked me to join them. So again, I said yes, and I followed them to public school. I became Sophia's Braille transcriptionist, basically her support person, modifying materials in the classroom so it would be accessible to her and for her. And then from there, decided to go back to school because I loved it so much. So that's basically where my journey began. I've been doing this in one aspect, sort of, or another for the last 20 years. And it all began with Sophia and her family.
That's a great story. And you bring such passion to your role. I know this from talking to you and Laura. So Laura's influence really paid off, not only for your students, but it sounds like for you, because you really enjoy what you do.
Absolutely. Without Sophia or Laura or their whole family, as you know, Ben, you've met probably them all. They're a very supportive group. So Laura and Sophia both have helped pave this journey for me. And, I'm so grateful for both of them. Laura for kind of nudging me and Sophia for inspiring me.
Very well put. And Laura is an excellent nudger. I'd like to start off more generally here about what parents should think about when they have a child born with LCA or some other significant vision loss? And what are some of just the general things or guidelines they should be thinking about as they begin this low vision educational journey with their child?
So I think for a lot of families, when they first get that diagnosis, it's a bit of a shock. There's a lot of fear and concern of, what the future may look like for my child. There's a lot of wonderful resources. Hope and Focus is one of them out there on the internet and that sort of thing. But, within the local community and the schools, there are also a lot of wonderful supports to start with. I have to say that early intervention is key. The sooner that you can get teacher of the visually impaired or an education consultant on the team or involved with your child, the better. There are a lot of things that children with visual impairments or congenital blindness miss out on incidentally from a learning perspective that their sighted peers pick up on. So, knowing how to model certain behaviors or certain skills such as feeding or, just safety travel, it's really helpful to get support early on so that, independent children become independent adults. So the sooner that we can get those skills developed or started with the children with visual impairments, the better off they will be and more successful as adults.
Sure. And you use that word independent. And I've heard this from you and others in talking about the journey for kids, that's really one of the most important things, is helping that child be as independent as possible.
So I feel like the skill of independence, it really is a skill. It needs to be learned and taught within the home, and then it will carry over into the school and then later into life in school, in a community or in the workforce. But without those independent skills, a child with a visual impairment will always be dependent on someone or something. So being able to be independent at home to do, like life skills sort of thing, or being able to be independent at school, accessing things using assistive technology that will carry over into the workforce to help them to be a successful adult and potentially live on their own versus being cared for the rest of their lives.
Certainly, certainly. And I think that's a good segue into my next question, into a related topic. I think it's somewhat related. I see kids with vision impairments going into schools for the blind, and then you see kids with the same level of, significant vision loss being mainstreamed. How does a family decide which path to take? Does it depend on maybe the school system, the child?
It depends on the child and what their needs are. So there are a lot of options for outplacement for students from the public school perspective, specialized school for children of who are blind or have visual impairments. But really, I'm more of an advocate for the least restrictive environment, which is through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It really just ensures that students with disabilities are educated alongside their non-disabled peers, because although some of these outplacement programs are appropriate for some students, it isn't for all. So it's really important from a team perspective, for evaluations to be done, to make sure that the student is able to or not able to access the curriculum. It really is a whole team decision. Parents sometimes think that their child needs to go to a specialized school to learn specialized skills. That's not necessarily always the case. So I think it really is more individualized. But like I said, I'm more of a cheerleader for staying in your home school. These are the people and the students and the kids that your child's going to grow up with. They're the ones that they're going to see in the grocery store when they're older. They're the people that are going to be at church with them. So it's more of a community-based versus, going to an outplacement for a longer period of time. Outplacements are important, I think, for specialized skills, maybe in like a transition before a student goes away to college or something like that, that they need more specialized skills. But overall, it is, like I've mentioned, more individualized.
Right, right. And I know part of the challenge is let's say parents decide, okay, we want to mainstream our child. School systems differ quite a bit. They vary widely in what they provide and how they support their students with vision loss. If they happen to be in your school system, they're pretty lucky because they have you and all the resources you can access. How do you recommend a family go about working with a school system, thinking that or considering that they might not always get everything that perhaps the student is entitled to?
So because I work for the state, I don't work for a district. I'm in a lot of different districts and a lot of different school systems. So I think there are definitely some school districts that are a little easier to work with. But the most important thing for families to understand is that if you feel that something is needed or necessary for your child to be successful, you need to ask for it because no one else is going to advocate for you for that. I have a lot of families that may watch, something online or, listen to a podcast, or then they come to a meeting and they're like, my student needs this, this, and this. Some assistive technology that is way beyond what they're capable of being able to use. Again, that word independent, not necessarily use it, but be able to use it by themselves or without adult support. I think it's really important to be asking those questions, but that's why the school districts have teams of professionals working towards the common goal for the student versus just one person making the decisions. So I think it's really important to, like I said, advocate for anything you feel that your student or child, I should say, may or may need, but understand that there's a process that goes along with it as well. So it may not be an immediate solution. It may sort of open up a door for communication or for conversation for forward progress later on.
It obviously makes sense to be diplomatic, but if a family isn't getting some basic services that the child is entitled to, should they pursue legal action or go down the legal path at all?
So I have to be careful with legal stuff because I do work for the state. So, and I can only speak on behalf of the state of Connecticut. Other districts and other states, they have different laws that they have to follow. So from I'm a parent. If I were sitting around, and I'm going to speak from that perspective rather than a professional, I'm going to switch hats for a second, Ben, just for my professional career's sake. From a parent hat perspective, sitting around in a PPT, if you feel that you are not getting the level of services that you feel your child needs or deserves, then that is your right to request more. However, there are guidelines that are set up. Like, for example, with our agency, there are certain guidelines. So like I can provide direct services for students who are Braille readers, but I provide consultation services for all of my other students on my caseload. So I service children from birth to age 22. So my little babies that I work with, it's more of a consultation model. So it might be like once a month that I'm going into the home and working with birth to 3. And then same sort of thing on the opposite end of the spectrum with my transition students. They're in the workforce. I'm coming in, I'm giving some, supports. It's those kiddos in the middle that, those academic, low vision or no vision students that sometimes you have to fight for a little bit more, but that's also part of my job as well. Like I'm not just going in to teach Braille or to teach, work on career readiness or assistive technology. I'm also there to teach self-determination and self-advocacy to my students. So, it sometimes is delivered a little bit better coming from the mouths of a student than the parent. So a lot of my students will develop what's called a vision statement. And it's not necessarily talking about their, vision for their future, but it's like how they use their vision, what tools they need to be successful. So it puts the accountability on the teachers directly from the student. So the student can follow up and say, remember that thing we talked about in my PPT? I mentioned I need this to be successful. Do you think you could provide that for me? So it's really sort of helping the student to self-advocate as, again, a team member so that the parents aren't always put in that position.
I think advocacy is so important, and perhaps that's the most important thing that you teach kids and parents is how to advocate and to be advocates. I mean, we all need to learn to self-advocate, but when somebody has a visual impairment or some other special need, that becomes even more paramount. And of course, as they refine that skill over time and get older, it helps them in so many different ways in their lives, whether it's relationships, work, or whatever, being able to know how to advocate for oneself. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And that's sort of a good segue into my next question is, what are some of the general skills or considerations that every family needs to think about as the school journey starts? We've already talked about learning how to advocate. I think that's a great place to start. What are some of the other common needs, as far as like reading and, doing gym class or all that, the stuff where some special accommodations may come into play?
So from my perspective, my responsibility as a teacher of the visually impaired isn't just to teach compensatory skills, which is, access to the curriculum, whether that's Braille, large print, regular print, symbols. Some of my students are multiply impaired, visually impaired, and their learning media is, objects. So it's a lot of things so compensatory skills is one of them. Assistive technology. It's a whole bundle of things called the expanded core curriculum. So they're skills that are unique to a child or who has a visual impairment, who, again, we kind of talked about that earlier about incidental learning, that they're not really learning through taking things in visually in their community or within experiences within the school. They're specialized skills that need to be taught. So you said like PE, for example, that would be recreation and leisure. So, some parents may be like, oh, my child will never play an organized sport. Well, that's not true. There's, goal ball. They have an amazing goal ball team at Perkins School for the Blind. And, a PE teacher or an APE teacher, adaptive PE teacher, who's really creative, like Sophia's in elementary school. He created a goal ball court in the gymnasium and had the whole class participate in this blind specific sport, which was so cool. It's really just, there are all these little pockets, orientation, mobility, safe travel. So these are the skills that, again, from an early intervention perspective can start being introduced to sort of help navigate or bridge the skills that aren't learned incidentally to support a student with a visual impairment.
Would you say that as the parents and the child embark on this journey, there are moments of fear, frustration? I mean, we all have these regardless of our abilities, but I guess what I'm asking is, when there are difficult moments, do you have any advice for perhaps how a family can address the challenging emotions that might come up with this journey, where maybe a child isn't immediately succeeding as well as everybody wants?
Well, the reality is really like I have a little Braille reader in second grade right now, and he is super smart, but he's learning Braille. So, from a sighted perspective, all of his peers in his class are flying. They're reading these long books, and he wants to read these long books. But the skills involved for him to read are, he needs to be able to use his hands. He needs to be able to track. He needs to be decoding. He needs to be understanding if there's contractions he knows or if he doesn't. There are like 6 or 7 extra steps that he needs to do to be where his peers are. last year he barely even had the alphabet. This year he's reading, short stories, that I'm creating through ChatGPT, which is an amazing tool. But he struggled. He didn't want to read. He was really discouraged. But I had a lesson with him earlier today, and he requested to read a book that we read 2 months ago that he just really struggled through. And today we read it again together, and he was picking out things like, that's a new contraction I know. This is this, and this is that. And he was just so excited. And it was like it finally clicked. So it's kind of like, thinking about from, like a typical child development perspective. Everyone's always looking at those milestones like, oh, did my child walk at 12 months, or did my child speak in full sentences at 18 months or whatever? It's important to know that your children are able to do everything that their sighted peers can do, and they will do it, but they're going to do it at their own pace. And when they're ready, they're going to soar. You just can't let them give up. There's any little triumph is a huge triumph. It's going to take a little bit longer. You might have to go in, what do they say? If you can't go in through the door, you find a window or a bulkhead, or, you climb the roof and you go down the chimney. There's going to be a way to do it. You just may not have to do it the most traditional way. And then, the perseverance, and patience.
Right. And I think a great success story, and maybe you can elaborate on this, I'll tell you how much I know, is Laura's daughter, Sophia, went on to get, I know, a bachelor's degree, and I think she was had a triple major and graduated with a triple major. That's pretty impressive.
Yes. And I like to say Sophia makes me look good, but she did it all on her own. She really did. And, there were days in high school, she would never use her cane at all. Or she would just travel around and you wouldn't even know that she was visually impaired. And she would always say that she wanted a dog. And this is like my most favorite story with Sophia. She'd always say, I'm going to have a dog. I'm going to have a dog, Mrs. Borsowitz. And I'm like, you're not going to get a dog if you don't travel independently. If you don't use a cane, you're never going to qualify to get a dog. So she would be walking down the hall and not using her cane. And I would literally bark at her, like a little dog, like you're missing out. You're never going to get a dog. You're missing out. So my biggest thing that was was very emotional for me is we went to Florida for a conference for Hope and Focus. It was the Foundation Fighting Blindness. And we went, and Sophia and I went together, but separately. And she called me and asked me to meet up for coffee. Now we're in a resort in Orlando, like Disney Orlando, not just Orlando, crazy. And she's like, I said, well, do you want me to find you? I'll meet you in the lobby. And she's like, no, I'll meet you at this restaurant. I'm like, okay, see you then. And sure enough, she was there waiting for me. And she was there with her cane. She traveled independently. It was so cool to be able to think of her as this little 3-year-old with a newly diagnosed with these little Coke bottle glasses, and just absolutely adorable. And then she's standing there in front of me as this beautiful, independent, capable young adult. And it was just, she did that on her own. I mean, if it were me, I would still be barking at her, but she had the motivation to travel independently. She used the cane. And that's the other thing too, I think, with a lot of my students. I might think something's important to them in this moment, but until they have the buy-in, it's never going to happen. So, until they really feel that this is a need that I have, to be successful, to be independent, it's never going to hit. But she never would have gone to France. She got her guide dog that following summer, I believe it was. And she is just living life. But she did that on her own. I'd like to take a little bit of credit, but she definitely accomplished all of that on her own.
Well, I think you're being extremely modest. And of course, at the end of the day, we all have to do things on our own. But I'm sure you helped point her in the right direction. And that barking you did, I'm sure, helped her along. So Thank you for the role that you play and the support you provide. And I loved the themes that came out of this discussion of fostering independence, advocacy, and success might be a little different at times on the journey, but everybody can succeed in their own way and in whatever way is meaningful for them. And I think that's really important for all our listeners to understand, especially the families out there who are starting out on this challenging journey with a child with low vision. So, Beth, thank you for taking time out of your busy day to talk to us and sharing your perspective and some great anecdotes. I think we've all learned quite a bit.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And I hope some families will find some good little tidbits in what I shared today.
I'm sure they will. And listeners, thanks as always for joining the Hope and Focus podcast. Thanks, Eve Orcutt, for your help in production and recording. And we look forward to having you back for the next episode.
Whether you live with vision loss or love someone who does, this space is for you. To learn more about Hope and Focus and join us in advancing treatments for LCA, visit hopeandfocus.org and connect with us on social media at Hope and Focus 1. Together, we're bringing hope into focus.